Alright, this is calling them on having unclean hands. They're violating the unclean hands doctrine of 1914. I who shall not be with legal name hereby proclaim to all with unclean hands. Be it now known that all word spellings upon within this document shall be of my will and intent only, without assumption, presumption, on, of, by, for, any, all concerned, where my free will choice shall never be trespassed, for my intent is my intent and no others. Whereas the great fraud has been revealed and is laid bare, where unclean hands are now in light for all to see, where any all with unclean hands must judge only self, toto genre. Whereas non-disclosure has intent to defraud in that act, any all contracts of body, mind, soul are null and void, no protunc, preteria ab initio, ad infinitum in this willful intent to commit fraud by omission and or commission where others and all are concerned, and whereas threat of force, perceived or real, is proof of intent inasmuch as aiding and abetting in this fraud, and where assumption and presumption is concerned, thus destroyed, and whereby one is known by their actions of that their willful intent, either knowingly or in ignorance of the divine laws under which all stand, and whereas all signatures, contracts, assumptions, presumptions, etc. all are rendered null and void ab initio, inasmuch as all are in contempt fraud, where the crown owned and copyright names Robert Ambrose Demetriou, Janice Elaine Demetriou, nee Sutton, Christopher Robert Demetriou, Treva Lynn Demetriou, nee Grimm, Danica Noel Demetriou, Chloe Renee Demetriou are concerned, and whereas the intent to commit fraud via deceptions, deceptios, and willful non-disclosure of truths were intent to enslave all humanity, mankind, by church state, and this intent is exposed fully whereby one's actions make one known, and whereas all names registered are, in fact, property of the Crown Vatican, all matters pertaining to such names registered and the use thereof render all parties fraudulent in contempt by willful intent to deceive and or ignorance of use, where all matters of church state remain matters of church state, where use of the names registered are concerned, and where when third party interloping is evident by my use or anyone's use of stated registered names, and where it is not my intent to commit fraud or any contemptible acts, it is also my equal intent to never aid and abet any other living soul by willfully knowing or ignorance on and there my part, and any use of or claim made using the aforementioned names will render such attempt an act of fraud by willful commission, and whereas any all use of church state identification based upon these all crown copyright names or any variations thereof renders the user in fraud absolute by their ignorance and by omission of disclosure of by church state, and whereas any all claims made by any all parties, agents, living souls upon another willfully or in ignorance to do so is guilty of fraud in that action by commission and or omission of bearing false witness, and is in contempt of church state self, and is willfully aiding and abetting fraudulent deception deceptios, whereupon judgment is rendered upon any all agents of church state self by the very action of claiming by a crown copyright fraud, and inasmuch as intent, spirit must be proven where all are concerned, it is now incumbent upon the church state that the willful intent to commit fraud ab initio is without intent to do so. With prior knowledge, the agents, clergy, bar members, all bound by oaths, etc., to, of, for, by, with, church state, did do willfully deceive humanity, and is, by the actions of all bound to church state, by oath sworn, taken, given, judged by, of, in, all acts of harm upon any all harmed, and whereas fraudulent intent of all bound to church state entities, living souls, principalities is visible via omission and or commission by the actions of harm, intent to harm of, for, by all beings using a name in fraud ab initio, all claims made, coerced, assumed, presumed, etc. at all are in fact fraudulent at source, of, for, by all claiming any all legal names, fictional identities, titles, etc. at all, and or thus any all forms, aliases, and are of, by, for the criminal intent to do so using the intellectual property of another living being, soul, spirit, or dead fictional entity, where I am toto genre, spirit, mind, body, and furthermore, to engage in such intently destructive acts of harm, deception, theft, coercion, etc. against another via any all means, as shown by one's actions, and need never be judged, whereby the act is the judge in and of itself. Judge not lest ye be judged, where assumption, presumption cannot, does not, will not exist after the act itself, and furthermore, any all registration, registering, register by omission and or commission where full disclosure is not evident, the intent of church state, any all claiming such association, joinder, by means of willful oaths, signatures, cursive, titles, etc. are in fact willful acts of predetermined fraud, knowingly or unknowingly, where willful or wrongful obligations, curses, has is was the intent, where obligations is are replaced back upon those who knowingly and or in ignorance of their fraud do so ab initio ad infinitum nunc pro tunc praeterea, and furthermore, was never my intent to willfully use the property of another, whereas any all things registered are in fact claimed to be such intellectual property of another, namely church, state, crown, where my mother and father deceased unknowingly were in ignorance, aided and abetted of their consent into such church, state contracts, be they all forms of physical, psychological, spiritual, mental, and furthermore, I place the onus on us back upon return to any and all beings by virtue of their oaths, etc., and self-judge in their acts, any all obligations created by any all contracts, where all contracts entered into based on this fraud, original sin, intent to defraud, are nullified, null and void, ab initio ad infinitum nunc pro tunc, and furthermore, all obligations upon myself created by this fraud are void inasmuch as the perceived, assumed, presumed gift, without consideration of any all names, is concerned, and that a bond debt has been created in the form of a birth certificate with an assigned debt, not value, where I was assumed, presumed to be that value, without void of my willful consent, where has been the willful intent of by for all parties initiating such acts of obligation upon this their debt, and whereas intent is clearly visible by any all who engage in acts of commerce, whore of Babylon, using the name, mark of the beast, has been, will be acting in fraud, and creating harm, cannibalism against their fellow humans beings, since all fiat currency is based upon aforementioned bonds, and is guilty of human being trafficking of the highest order in defiance of creation where consumption ensues, and whereas the willful intent from any all willful associates, members, oath beings of church, state, crown is evidentiary proof of by for any all acts perpetrated against another, where any all registered names are concerned, inasmuch as non-disclosure by aforementioned was never given, offered, where aiding and abetting in fraud is the intent, and where any all aforementioned have unclean hands accordingly, and whereas any all registered things, possessions, are in fact property of the church, court, state, crown, copyright, where any claim made by any all not oath to the aforementioned are matters of church, court, state, crown, inasmuch as willful trespass and enticement into slavery via third party interloping into such matters that do not concern me, the one who now shall not be of legal name, where my own customary calling is mine and shall never be given, and furthermore, by means of this birth certificate, long form, short form, deception, non-disclosure, willful act of fraud, the only documents ever willfully given as proof of intent to commit fraud, aid and abet fraud, by, of, for, church, state, court, crown, etc. and all oath bonded to willfully to such titles, fictions, corporations, where the claim is also made that the aforementioned take on the role of perceived parents, Petrea, embodiment of state, and have are, in fact, kidnapped, abused, harmed any all who have been fraudulently claimed to be a ward of admiralty, where the mother is fiduciary, father is beneficiary ab initio, and whereas the rights of both mother and father have been stolen via non-disclosure and willful intent as proof by actions of those, by oath, willful applications, any all claiming to be of, for, by, church, court, state, crown, in the form of birth certificates, licenses, marriages, family names, taxes, registrations, etc. ab initio. Therefore, is it thee your willful intent of this, you of, for, by, in, church, court, state, crown, etc. beings, living, dead, fictions, to coerce, by force or deceptive means, to have me incriminate myself where I am in full knowledge of this dual fraud, where willful intent to do so makes me and you guilty ab initio by claiming to own or be something that is, has never been mine or yours to be or claim? Is it your, by oath entity, intent to aid and abet the furtherance of this fraud, cannibalism, child kidnapping, human trafficking, theft, etc., via fictitious acts, legislation, etc., by of for dead entities, by for of dead entities, dead carrying out the dead, where I am one of the living versus a fictional dead entity created by for of the church, court, state, crown, by enticing me via force, coercion, deception to be a surety for the church, state, court, crown created debts? Whereas any all fraud by virtue of its intent and creation remains as such, regardless of length of time taken for such any all frauds to be exposed, all contracts are null and void upon its discovery, where a fraud revealed is, in fact, null and void ab initio nunc pro tunc, where all energy stolen in any all form shall be returned, where the intent to commit fraud against me will be with intent. It is not, has never been, never will be my intent to willfully and knowingly commit fraud, where mistakes and ignorance by commission and or omission are present, and where any all acts of mine are not in contempt or with temptation of anyone, anything, where any being choosing willfully to contempt me is now with intent to do so. All contracts, documents, signatures, agreements, etc. at all are now null and void, where any all debt created by the church, state, court, crown is forgiven, returned from whence it was created. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, where I am the non-contracting living with the debt bond entity that is the property responsibility of that those which created it. It is furthermore the obligation of any all oath beings of by for the church, state, court, crown to return my energy creation's life force stolen by this original sin intent to defraud my mother and father where they aided and abetted in my own fraud by means of deception, non-disclosure, where your unclean hands are have been concerned. I seek no vengeance, I offer no judgments, and return the obligations of debts, forgiveness to those who would have deceived me, where a crime against all humanity is being perpetrated with willful intent in the light for all to see. By one's actions one is known and instantly judged in of for by such actions where the intent is laid bare for all to see, in of by for any all such actions, whereas all beings willfully by for of commission omission are held and bound, judged of themselves, act accordingly lest ye be judged in of for by yourself, oneself, yourself fully. Toto genre.